Hello, I'm Guy Grannum. I've been researching and writing about Caribbean family history and heritage for almost 30 years, since finding out that my paternal ancestry came from Barbados, having settled there in the 1730s. Today I'm going to briefly describe records that can be used for the study of migration of people from the Caribbean to Britain from the 1600s, but especially from the 1850s. Until recently, people from the Caribbean were commonly called West Indians, a term referred to people from the Commonwealth countries and territories in the Caribbean, but also Guyana, Belize, and Bermuda, which had similar histories. When archives refer to someone as being West Indian, they could be talking about someone born in the West Indies, someone who settled or was resident in the West Indies, or someone who traded with the West Indies. We started colonising the Caribbean from the 1620s, and from that time settlers returned to Britain, but it was not until the Second World War that large numbers of people travelled from the Caribbean and settled in the UK. Planters and merchants often sent their children to British schools and universities, and many retired to Britain bringing their enslaved servants with them. Many soldiers, sailors, and merchant seamen served in the Caribbean and formed local relationships and often brought their wives and children home with them to the UK. Caribbean-born seamen, sailors, and soldiers often discharged in the UK and remained. Until the 10 yearly censuses, it was not possible to know how many West Indians were resident in the United Kingdom. Place of birth or nationality is not usually recorded. Until 1962, there were few barriers to British West Indian migration. They were British subjects, with the right to travel, settle, and work in Britain without restrictions. Ethnicity is also not usually recorded, and while white West Indians could integrate with the general population, people of African or Asian heritage were more visible minorities. These are some of the key moments affecting or influencing migration from the Caribbean. In 1772, James Somerset, an enslaved servant, won his court case not to be sent back to slavery in the Caribbean. This and the anti-slave trade and later anti-slavery movements from the 1780s probably led to a reduction in the number of enslaved servants brought to Britain from Caribbean. The abolition of the British slave trade laws from 1807 restricted the movement of enslaved people within and from the Caribbean. The British Caribbean slave trade ended in 1834 and apprenticeship in 1838. This had two effects. Former enslaved people were now free to travel, but also British Caribbean colonies had an economic downturn, causing planters and merchants to leave. During the two world wars, Caribbean people served in the armed forces as munitions and forestry workers and as merchant seamen, and many settled in the UK following peace. There was always movement of people from the Caribbean to the UK, but before the Second World War, West Indians were more likely to travel to the United States, Canada, and other countries in the Caribbean and Central and South America for education and work. In 1948, the offer of cheap tickets encouraged about 500 Jamaicans to travel to London on the Empire Windrush, which later defined the migration movement to the UK. But it was probably increasing restrictions on the immigration to American countries and a number of devastating hurricanes which encouraged large numbers of people to leave the Caribbean to work and settle in Britain. The 1960s saw increased migration. It was also a period when Caribbean countries started to gain independence, starting with Jamaica in 1962, and so people needed to decide their nationality. At the same time, the first of a number of nationality laws were enacted, which increasingly restricted the free movement of predominantly non-white Commonwealth citizens to the UK. Did these factors influence migration? The government started gathering information about the population in 1801, but the 1851 census was the first to record place of birth. Between 1851 and 1931, there were about 8 to 9,000 Caribbean-born people in Britain. Because of the war, there wasn't a census in 1941, and in 1951 census shows there wasn't that much change with about 16,000 people. But there was significant migration in the 50s and 60s to a peak in 1971. Thereafter, laws were passed limiting movement from Commonwealth countries, include the Caribbean, and so the Caribbean-born population starts to decrease. The numbers for 1891 onwards are from the Office of National Statistics published reports. The earlier ones are estimated by querying the online censuses, which we'll talk about later. The 1841 to 1911 censuses have been indexed and digitised, which helps family historians, but also for the first time allows researchers to do demographic studies. I chose 1851 as it was the first to include place of birth. Searching the online indexes proved very challenging due to the lack of standardisation by the enumerator, the person collecting the forms, but also because the indexing errors is due to poor handwriting. Without going into details, I had to be very creative in my searches and subsequent analysis. The figures I've got here are probably, well, approximate, as I haven't been able to check every single entry. So it's possibly some of those that are recorded as West Indies, when I look at the records, probably Westmoreland or Westminster. And of course, many Caribbean counties, parishes and villages are named after UK places such as Surrey, Middlesex and Cornwall in Jamaica. And you've got Kingston, Surrey, for example, in Jamaica, but also Kingston, Surrey in Surrey, and Warwickshire Parish in Bermuda. So I may have missed some by not checking all those records. I found just over 7,000 people, and unfortunately about a quarter are recorded as only being from the West Indies, but the majority, about 2,500, are from Jamaica, with large numbers from Barbados, Bermuda and Guyana. This is a map showing the same information, just in case you don't know where the Caribbean is. Jamaica has the largest circle in the centre of the picture, here, with about 2,500 people. To the north is Bermuda, and then just to the right of the chain of islands is Barbados, and to the bottom right is Guyana. This is a plot of the people I found in England in the 1851 census. There isn't really a Caribbean community as we know it now, just probably about 7,000 people, individuals and families from 18 different territories scattered across the country without a sense of community, as many would have had very different cultural, social or economic experiences. 1851 was just 17 years after the abolition of slavery and 13 years after apprenticeship, and so there would be people here who were born into slavery as well as former slaveholders. I was able to drill into the data further, and this is a heat map of Barbadian-born residents. As expected, most people gravitated to London as they do now, but there are also hotspots in the former slave ports of Bristol and Liverpool, and in the industrial heartland around Birmingham. This slide here shows the top 20 occupations of a random 800 people that I analysed. Most are from sort of middle class and professional occupations such as clergy, military personnel, boarding school pupils, landholders, people of independent means, but amongst these are also servants and labourers. Moving on from 1851 to the most recent census of 2011, the census statistical information is available through the Office of National Statistics, but personal data is still closed for 100 years. Here I've sort of fudged it a bit with Jamaica, there are more Jamaicans here than any of the other islands put together. Barbadians are still high, but people from Trinidad and Tobago and Guyana are significantly higher. They had smaller populations in 1851, which grew significantly during the latter half of the 19th century, with migrant labour, especially from India. Ethnicity was first recorded in the 1991 census. Here again is for the 2011 census. As expected, the majority of Caribbean-born people are recorded as Black Caribbean, about 77%. I was quite surprised by the number of white West Indians here, which is about 6.5%. Asian West Indians are not so high. They're only, 1.2% here. But these statistics don't include Guyana, which are under South America. These come under the Caribbean. Note that there is a category for Black Caribbean and not for any other Caribbean ethnicity, which means that second and later generations for non-Black Caribbean people become hidden in the general populations for those ethnic groups. It's difficult to research migrants, especially from British overseas settlements, as they were not recorded or monitored in the same way that foreign subjects sometimes were. Foreign subjects are recorded as aliens in the records. However, there are some records you can use research migrants from the Caribbean, and I'll describe each of these for the rest of this talk. While researching my own family history and parish records in the UK, I'd seen entries in the baptism registers where some people recorded as being born in Europe, such as France and Germany, and I wondered why. I later found out that this was because they were born outside of the parish at the time when the parish was responsible for providing welfare. The registers were used as evidence that the parish may not have to support them if the person became unemployed and needed relief. If that was the case, the parish officials would usually try to send the people to their place of birth or place of settlement, though obviously for people born overseas, because of the distances and costs involved, it's unlikely that they would have been removed. For this reason, Caribbean-born people are sometimes recorded in the registers. Vicars also sometimes noted ethnicity, but this is not always the case. Anglican registers, those for the Church of England, are held by the local archive services, and non-conformist registers by the National Archives. Many registers and indexes are online, but it's not always possible to search by this additional information, such as place of birth or ethnicity. Luckily, many local archive services are separately indexing parish registers and other records for the study of minority communities in their localities, and this does reveal Black and Caribbean people within those communities. This is an example of an Anglican baptism register from the London Metropolitan Archive on Ancestry. John Williams was baptised in St Luke's Church, Chelsea in 1818. He was a seaman born about 1760, so was about 58 when he baptised. Interestingly, the vicar noted that his parents, Thomas and Peggy, were recorded as being Negroes in Barbados. This is a nonconformist baptism register held by the National Archives on the genealogist. Francis Young Thorp was born in Jamaica, where his parents, Mary and John, are enslaved on the estate of Mr. Thorp. I've tried to find them in the Jamaican slave registers, which are online in Ancestry, but there are just too many possibilities. Also, there aren't people. Most of the slaveholders are Tharp rather than Thorpe, so maybe there's a typo here or a mistake here. The entry continues further down the page, which I've cropped out. When he was examined, it was found that his knowledge of Christian principles were defective, and so the baptism was deferred. I don't know if he was later baptized. Although not needed as evidence of settlement, marriage and burial registers also sometimes record this additional information. John Adams Wood is recorded here as being from Antigua, and he was buried in St Mary Abbott's Church in Kensington on the 4th of February 1836. He was living in Tavistock Square. He was aged 53. John Adams Wood was a planter and slaveholder with estates in Bermuda and Antigua. This is an example of the 1832 slave register for Antigua, which lists 7 enslaved people. In the notes at the bottom, which I've tried to highlight here, but they are difficult to read, in 1828 he left for London and brought his servant Molly, who quitted his service. Molly is better known as Mary Prince, whose biography influenced the anti-slavery movement. The next collection of records I'm going to be looking at are those of the Prerogative Court of Canterbury. Most people's wills are proved where the deceased person lived. However, people who died overseas and had money in or estate in the UK could have their wills proved in the UK. And until 1858 in England and Wales, this was the Prerogative Court of Canterbury, and from 1858 the Probate Registry. And there are similar courts in Ireland and Scotland. Wills are a wonderful resource, referring to family and property in the UK and Britain and in the Caribbean. The Prerogative Court of Canterbury wills are held by the National Archives, and they've been digitised and indexed, and you can search by place. There are a few early wills for mariners who are sailing in the Caribbean and died in the Caribbean. Most of those are actually before we actually started settling in the Caribbean. But the earliest will I can find is for a John Simmons, who was a labourer in Barbados in 1628, and he refers to money owed for him in the UK. Searching by place reveals that the majority of wills are for people in Jamaica, with large numbers from Barbados, Antigua, and St Kitts. In the name of God, Amen. I, John Sober, later the parish of St Peter in the island of Barbados, but now of Little Birthstead in the county of Essex, Esquire. This is a typical introduction for a will of someone recently arrived in the UK, or arrived in England. Although he's from Barbados, this is indexed under Birthstead, where he resided at the time of his will, when he wrote out his will. The Sobers were a settler family in Barbados and owned a number of plantations, including Mount Gay. You may be familiar with the rum. One of my ancestors, Henry Grannum, died there in 1854, but I've not yet found out why he was there. I've used this as an example of the challenges of finding Caribbean migrants. Most of the people listed here actually were born in Barbados, but only one, that of Samson Wood Sober, mentions they're actually from Barbados. When you read the wills, 7 of them actually reveal they're actually from Barbados, talking about their family and their estates in Barbados, even though all of them here are living in, well, mostly actually in Middlesex, in what's now, well, now the London parts of Middlesex, and including John Sober of Little Birthstead, Essex. The next set of records I'm going to be talking about are the censuses. We looked at the 1851 earlier. The censuses have been carried out every 10 years, with the exception of 1941 because of the war. Many of you will complete one next year. The information recorded changes over time, and we'll look at some of those in the next slides. The censuses for 1841 to 1911 are digitised and have been indexed by most genealogical companies. The 1921 census should become open in 2022, as records are closed for 100 years. The returns tend to be arranged by address, and for the 1841 records name of people in a household with age, occupation, and roughly where they were born, with a column for those born in the same county, and a second column for those born in Ireland, Scotland, or foreign parts. Usually they just enter Y for yes. Unusually, you see here Patrick and Sarah Lynch were born in Jamaica and Barbados, but their children are just born somewhere in Kent. They may have been born in Chatham, but it may have been somewhere else. The 1851 census asks for more information, such as marital status, relationship to the head of household, and county and parish of birth. I mean, I'm sorry this is not very clear, but these have been taken from digitised copies of microfilm. This return for James Meacock in Everton shows that his wife and 2 of their children were born in Jamaica. You can just see that to the right, and in brackets it says West Indies, though it's not very clear. It may often say BS or British subject, though that didn't need to be spelt out because they actually were British subjects. Interestingly, their servant Elizabeth Oakley is also from Jamaica, and interestingly, they recorded her as black. Now, again, that's quite uncommon. She is 45 and so born in 1806, and therefore was probably born enslaved. Whether she was enslaved by the Meacocks or not, I don't know. I haven't actually researched that. This is a copy from the 1881 census. It doesn't ask for any more information. I've just got this out of interest because it includes the nurse Mary Seacole, who's living with her friend Rose Boyden in Marylebone, Middlesex. This was taken on the 3rd of April, just 5 weeks before Mary died on the 14th of May. It doesn't say she's a nurse, it says she's of independent means. It means she's got her own money. The 1911 census is the first one where the forms survive as completed by the householder rather than by the enumerator. This return from Wokingham is completed and signed by Rose Gordon. She is from Scotland, from Girvan, but all of her children are from Tobago. The next set of records I'll be talking about ships' passenger lists. Surviving passenger lists are held by the National Archives and have been digitised and indexed on our ancestry. The earlier passenger lists record non-British subjects. The later ones from 1851 will also record British subjects, including those from the British Caribbean islands. Bear in mind that listed passengers are not necessarily migrants and will include tourists, visitors, businessmen and women, military personnel and people en route to the continent. Note that not everyone travelled directly from the Caribbean to the UK, and many may have disembarked at continental ports before travelling overland to Calais or to travel then on to the UK. These migrants are not recorded in UK passenger lists, though they may be found in the Continental Archive where they arrived. These passenger lists stop in 1960, and there are no records of passengers who travelled by plane. This is an example of an early passenger list of the Avon, which travelled from St Thomas in the Danish West Indies to Southampton in May 1845. It includes passengers from Cuba, Martinique and St Thomas. This is a bit more close-up showing merchants from Martinique and St Thomas and people from travelling from Cartagena. Now this is where they travelled from. This is an example of a more recent passenger list. It gives a lot more information. This is a passenger list for the Orbiter, which travelled from Trinidad to Liverpool in October 1948. These later passenger lists list British subjects first, then non-British subjects, and finally stowaways. They're usually arranged by class, first class, second class, third class, and then port of embarkation and ticket number. The information they record is surname. They don't always give first names. Sometimes it may be just Mr. Smith or Mr. A. Smith or Mrs. A. Smith. They may give the age, as they do in this particular entry, or date of birth. They give the profession, intended place of residence. Now, this may be just where they were staying after disembarking the ship before travelling on further. Country of last residence, sometimes nationality, sometimes additional information. This is a bit more detail. I've blanked out some of the names for data protection purposes. These will be people who are less than 100 years old. The examples you can see here are people travelling from Trinidad and Jamaica to London, Cardiff, Leicester, Nottingham, Birmingham and Derby. This is the passenger list for the Antilles, which arrived in Plymouth in October 1955. It shows people from Trinidad and Barbados who've come to work here in hotels and in hospitals, such as the Queen Mary's Hospital in Sidcup, Clacton District Hospital in Sussex, the Whittington Hospital in North London, and the Claybury Psychiatric Hospital in Woodford Green. I can't tell from here so some of them say hotel workers, some of them say Hotel London. I'm not sure if that's just where they're going to stay or actually where they're going to work. The Orange Nassau arrived in Plymouth on the 30th of March 1958. I chose this one. They've all travelled from Barbados, and here it just lists they're going to work for the London Transport Company, or London Transport Company has arranged for their group to travel. It doesn't say where they're staying, but here you've got conductors, engineers, carpenters, tailors, chauffeurs, as well as a fisherman and a tailor and a porter. This is the last group of records I'm going to be talking about. The registration of the UK and colonies was a form of naturalisation introduced in 1949 for people from the Commonwealth countries who were born British subjects, but as their countries became independent, needed to register to remain British. Duplicate certificates until 1986 are held by the National Archives and later ones by the Home Office. They are arranged by certificate number. They're not digitised, and for data protection purposes, people born less than 100 years ago are not indexed in the catalogue. If you want a certificate for someone born after 1919, you need to contact the National Archives. From 1962, nationality acts affected the status of Commonwealth migrants, and as we will see, registration seemed to peak in the period leading up to the implementation of major legislation. This chart shows a number of registrations for people born in the Caribbean, which, as you see, don't start until 1962, well, in fact 1963, after Jamaica's independence. As you can see, there's an obvious peak in 1982 after the 1981 Nationality Act was introduced, affecting the rights of settlements in the UK, and came into effect on the 1st of January 1983. The last slide show Caribbean registrations with all the countries put together. Here I've decided to show it as a map broken down by individual countries. And again, the largest blob is for Jamaica with, well, here about 84,000 registrations. The next largest ones are Guyana on the bottom, towards the bottom right, and then Trinidad and Tobago, and then Barbados just slightly off to the right of the Antilles. Here I plotted them where you can see the numbers are a bit more obvious. You're going from 84,000 for Jamaica here, down to 3 people from Anguilla. Here I've just got sort of annual registrations by year for about 8 countries. Don't look at it in detail. It just gives you an idea that basically they just move over time. The big one in Jamaica is Jamaica, and you can see again a huge peak there for 1982. They all show that sort of peak in 1972 and 1982 because of those two major pieces of legislation. So this example of for Barbados, which is independent in 1966. So the registration started in 1967, reaching a peak up to 1972, then drifts off slightly, and then you get again this huge peak of almost 1,400 people naturalised registering in 1982. Same for Grenada, independence in 1974, reaching a peak again in 1982. And Jamaica, going to, as I say, independence in 1962, get a little blip 1972, and then another huge peak in 1982. This is an example of a pre-1980 registration, which are very informative. They give you details on the name, address, date and country of birth, the birth name if it's different, the father's name, date of birth, marital status, spouse's name, nationality, addresses they lived at. It goes on for at least 2 sides. Details of any Crown service or Crown civil servants and people who worked in the army, in the forces, and any other special circumstances. So this is the registration of John Percival de Nobrega, who was born in Trinidad, as was his father. His wife's from Blackburn. He was a colonial civil servant, and this form contains, on the reverse, a potted biography saying he worked in Kenya and on retiring decided to settle in the UK with his son and daughter who were educated here. When I read this, it reminded me that my great-grandfather was also a colonial civil servant and retired in Kenya, but he never settled in the UK. After retirement, he first went to Majorca, but was evacuated during the Spanish Civil War, and then settled in Jersey during the German occupation, dying in 1946. My grandmother then migrated to South Africa. This is an example of a post-1980 registration. The information is a lot less detailed. It is literally just name, birth name if different, and date and country of birth. So here you've got Jacob Williams, born 1908 in Dominica. Thank you for listening. Do you have any comments or questions?